Association. He initiated the first critical conference on separation of church and state in Australia at the University of Melbourne in June this year. His book, The Purple Economy, has that been published yet, your book?
It's in my news item where that's at.
Excellent, okay. Max is also a member of the New South Wales Humanists and the New Zealand Association of Rationalists and Humanists. And he's also been meeting with the humanists down in Wellington and also Victoria University of Wellington religious studies people. Meg Wallace is a former lecturer in law at the University of Canberra and the author of the text Healthcare and the Law. So if we've got any questions about that sort of thing to do with law, which we often do, she moved to the Australian Capital Territory Department of Justice and Community Safety, where she wrote the Domestic Relationships Act, the first act recognising equal rights for individuals irrespective of their sexuality. Meg also participated in the drafting of Australia's first Bill of Rights, legislation passed by the Territory Government. She's also completing a doctorate at the Macquarie University, and she's also a member of the New South Wales and our association. So I'd like to welcome Max to the stand, please.
Thank you, Liz. I've got some news items to report before I start my talk in order to put my talk in a bit of context. The paper I'm going to give today arises from our 4-month stay in Europe last year, most of it in France, Switzerland and London. Our French colleagues have just released a media statement after a survey of French government funding of religion, especially Catholic schools, in contradiction of the French legislation. I expect there will be demonstrations in the streets about the fact that the French government are paying annually $10 billion euros, I should say, to various religions in France in contradiction of Article 2 of the 1905 legislation. The second bit of news is the information we gathered in Europe has been included in my book, which is finally finished and is before a publisher in Melbourne under consideration for publication. We initiated, as Liz mentioned, the first critical conference on separation of church and state at the University of Melbourne in June this year, and the papers from the conference have just been published as a book, and we'll send you a copy for your library when we get back to Australia. One of the speakers at the conference was Lynn Allison, the leader of the Australian Democrats, who is also an atheist. We have joined the Democrats and are experienced, and the Democrats, since we joined, have experienced a mild resurgence in the polls. Today's talk is not just theoretical. We have written a bill to separate church and state in New South Wales and South Australia. It's constitutionally possible to do that in Australia. This was indicated by a speech in the New South Wales Parliament on the 15th of November, so that is on the public record now. We have an electronic copy of that speech if anyone's interested. And just a couple of days ago, as Liz mentioned, we met with Professor Paul Morris in Wellington and also Marianne Maddox, who's an Australian academic working at Victoria University. And we put in a submission, as you have, to the draft statement on religious diversity in New Zealand. Professor Morris sends his regards to Bill, as I've told him. Now, down to the paper. What France has recognised, which most other countries have not, is that government temporal authority and church supernatural authority must be separate entities in a democracy. The separation between the two authorities should be seen as on a par with the separation of the powers of the executive, the judiciary and the legislature within a government. Of course, the executive is cabinet, prime minister and cabinet government, and the cabinet. The judiciary is the legal system, of course, and the legislature are your houses of parliament with an opposition that can ask questions and with committees. And so the democratic system is one of checks and balances. I'm saying, following the French, that there must be, in a democracy, a real constitutional divide between supernatural authority and temporal authority, and this graph was the graphic from our conference in June. The French call it Laicite, and it's the political idea that government must be characterised by a neutral playing field where incompatible ideas from atheism to various forms of the supernatural compete, but none are in the ascendancy. In this way, government is not anti-religious, but even-handed. It is only through such a system of government that the first separation of powers between temporal and supernatural authority can be achieved. As Professor Renaud argues, Laicite isn't simply one of the options of modernity because it's one of its foundations. The separation of the powers of executive, judiciary and legislature is also a French idea deriving from the work of the philosopher Montesquieu, who first expressed the idea in his Spirit of the Laws of 1748. In 1516, there was a concordat between the French king Francois I and the Pope. This concordat of Bologna created what is known as Gallicanisme, the idea that the king could have temporal authority over the church by the appointment of bishops and abbots. This statement of independence by the French monarchy was one of the first moves away from church authority. The first realisation of the separation of powers between the temporal authority of government and the supernatural authority of the church occurs, of course, with the French Revolution. But before the Revolution, under the Ancien Régime, French society was divided into 3 estates beneath the monarchy, but the monarchy was effectively a clerical state. Clericalism is defined as the pretension that a church has a place in the political order. The first estate was the king and the clergy, the second estate was the nobility. Together they represented as little as 5% of the population. The third order was everyone else. 85% peasantry and the remaining 10% the rising, politically disenfranchised merchant bourgeoisie. The peasantry was locked into what is called le sauvage. They were compelled to work for their seigneur, their nobleman, for the course of their lives. Another important fact about these 3 estates is that, apart from a tax paid by the church to the king, only the third estate paid tax, that is, the people. The monarchy, clergy and nobility lived largely off the taxes paid by the vast majority of the population. These taxes included le dîme, a tax of 10% in money or in kind, usually 10% of the harvest, paid by peasants to the church, and la corvée, a money tax paid to the nobility and monarchy for the privilege of mobility within the countryside. Le dîme was first inaugurated by Pope Pt1 le Bref during his reign in the 8th century AD. That is, the church was taking 10% until the French Revolution about 1,000 years. Schiappa notes that there were many other numerous and diverse taxes which echo the innkeeper's lines in Les Miserables. Here a little slice, there a little cut, 3% for sleeping with the windows shut. Well, when the majority must pay and the minority do not, that is a prescription for trouble. French authors like Voltaire and Rousseau railed against injustice, intolerance, and the notion that private property was the source of inequality. Ideas can be dangerous. In France, this intellectual culture, arguing for political freedom, was a catalyst for change. Combined with circumstances such as those of the 1780s, a bad harvest, shortage of money, arrogant decisions made by the monarchy, matters came to a head. In January 1789, the abbot Sieyès published a document entitled "What is the Third Estate?" In it he asked, what is the third estate? Everything. Until now, where has it been in the political system? Nowhere. What does it want? To be something. Another critical idea that occurred during the course of the revolution came from Talleyrand. Both these figures are religious radical figures.